Section 46 of All About Coffee. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. Read by Paul Lawley-Jones. All About Coffee by William Ukers. Chapter 30. Development of the Green and Roasted Coffee Business in the United States. Part 1. Coffee trading in the American colonies probably had its beginnings about the middle of the 17th century. Tea seems to have preceded coffee as an article of merchandise. Several merchants in the New England and New York settlements imported small quantities of coffee with other foodstuffs toward the close of the 17th century. The early supplies of the green bean were brought from the Dutch East Indies, Arabia, Haiti, and Jamaica. About 1787, the French opened Mauritius and Bourbon to American ships, which then began to bring back coffee and tea to the Atlantic coast cities. Mocha coffee was being imported direct from the American bottoms about 1804. Coffee from Brazil was first imported by the United States in 1809. Central America began shipping coffee to the United States in 1840. The total coffee imports in 1876 were 339,789,246 pounds, valued at $56,788,997, and received chiefly from Brazil, Haiti, British and Dutch East Indies, the West Indies, and Mexico. New York early became the leading green coffee market of the country. There was a number of large importing merchants in New York in 1760, nearly all of whom brought in coffee. Among them were Isaac and Nicholas Gouverneur, Robert Murray, Walter and Samuel Franklin, John and Henry Kruger, the Livingstons, the Beekmans, Lott and Lowe, Philip Cuyler, Anthony Van Dam, Hugh and Alexander Wallace, Leonard and Anthony Lispenard, Theophylact Bash, and William Walton. Leading New York coffee importers in 1786 were Henry Sheaf on the dock between Burling Slip and the Fly Market, John Rooney, 26 Cherry Street, William Eccles, 10 Hunter's Quay, Ludlow and Gould, 47 Wall Street, Scriber, Schroppel and Starman, 17 Queen Street, and William Taylor, Crane Wharf. The wholesale coffee roaster appeared about 1790. And from that time the separation between the green coffee trader and the coffee roaster became more marked. In 1794, the principal green coffee importers in New York were Lawrence and Van Zandt, D. Smith & Co., 323 Pearl Street, Gilchrist Dickinson, 17 Taylor's Wharf, Armstrong and Barnwall, 129 Water Street, William Bown, 269 Pearl Street, Stephen Cole and Son, 26 Ferry Street, J. S. de la Certe & Co., 123 Front Street, Joseph Tabot, 262 Pearl Street, Nathaniel Cooper & Co., 38 Little Dock Street, Col McGregor, 28 Wall Street, David Wagstaff, 137 Front Street, Conklin and Lloyd, 15 Taylor's Wharf, and S. B. Garrick Westfall & Co., 43 Cherry Street. The leading New York coffee importers in 1848 were Henry and William Delafield, 108 Front Street, and Des Arts and Henser, 78 Water Street. There were 7 leading New York coffee importers in 1854, as follows: Amar & Co., 34 South Street, Henry Coit & Son, 43 South Street, Henry Delafield, 129 Pearl Street, Howland and Aspinall, 54 South Street, Mason and Thompson, 33 Pearl Street, J. L. Phipps & Co., 19 Cliff Street, and Moses Taylor & Co., 43 South Street. Following the so-called Consortium of 1868, the ramifications of which centered in Frankfort on the Main, its speculations finally ending in disaster to many, the green coffee trade was in a precarious condition until well into the 80s. Previously, says a contemporary writer, it had been the safest and prettiest of all colonial produce. Around 1868, iron steamers began to be freely availed of as carriers of coffee, and later on, the telegraph became a factor, rendering the business more exciting and expensive. Coffee consumption in the United States had, moreover, increased from £1 per capita in 1790 to £9 per capita in 1882. 1892 to 93, the biggest figure in the world's coffee trade was George Kaltenbach, a German living in Paris, whose resources were estimated at $12 million to $15 million, and whose holdings at one time were said to be 1 million bags. He was reported to have made $1.5 million on his coffee corner. In September 1892, he bested a bull clique and forced prices down to 12 cents. Aided by 3 other European operators, he then started a bull syndicate and put the price up to 17 cents. The story of this corner, and of other notable coffee booms and panics, is told in more detail in Chapter 31. Early days of the green coffee business. For a long time, New York was the only important entry port for green coffee. Before the rise of New Orleans and San Francisco, many inland coffee roasters and grocers had their own buyers in the New York market. The coffee district that still clings about Lower Wall Street is rich in memories of bygone merchants who once were big factors in the trade and whose names, in many instances, have been handed down from generation to generation in the businesses that have survived them. Any reference to the early days of the green coffee importing, jobbing, and brokerage business in New York would not be complete without mention of a few of the pioneers. P.C. Meehan is 84 years old at the time of writing, 1922, and is Dean of the New York Green Coffee Trade. With James H. Briggs, he formed the firm of Briggs and Meehan. This later became Meehan and Schramm with Arnold Schramm. The latter withdrew, and the firm became Creighton, Morrison and Meehan. Finally, Mr. Meehan established the present firm of P.C. Meehan & Co. When Mr. Schramm withdrew from the firm of Meehan and Schramm, he founded the House of Arnold Schramm, Inc. Upon his retirement, this was succeeded by Sprague and Rhodes, the firm being composed of Benjamin Rhodes and Irvin A. Sprague. Next oldest to P.C. Meehan in the New York green coffee trade is Clarence Creighton, who started with Youngs and Aman, later C. Aman & Co., then Waite, Creighton and Morrison, then Creighton, Morrison and Meehan. Upon the breaking up of this firm, Mr. Creighton formed a partnership with James Ashland under the name of Creighton and Ashland. He later operated alone and died August 15, 1922. James H. Taylor is another old-timer who is still active. He began with T.T. Barr & Co. Later, with F.T. Sherman, he formed the firm of Sherman & Taylor. When Mr. Sherman withdrew, the firm became James H. Taylor & Co. Mr. Taylor is now with Minford, Luder & Co. He has been 5 years president, 11 years treasurer, and 26 years on the board of governors of the New York Coffee Exchange. One of the most honored names in the green coffee trade of New York is that of Peck. Edwin H. Peck began, at the age of 17 years, with Hart and Howell, butter and cheese merchants. He then went in the same business for himself. 4 years later, he abandoned this to go into the coffee brokerage business with his brother, Walter J. Peck. In about 5 years, the brothers branched into the coffee importing and jobbing business under the firm name of Edward H. Peck & Co. Later it was changed to the present style of E. H. and W. J. Peck. Since the death of Walter J. Peck in 1909, Edward H. has conducted the business. The latter was a member of the Board of Governors of the New York Coffee Exchange for 12 years and has been an important factor in the upbuilding of that institution. William D. Mackey began with Small Brothers & Co. He then went into partnership with C.K. Small as Mackey & Small. Later, he formed the firm of Arnold, Mackey & Co. with Francis B. Arnold. The latter dropped out, and the firm became Mackey & Co. He is now operating alone. Mr. Mackey was another of the incorporators of the New York Coffee Exchange. Alexander H. Purcell, a brother of Joseph Purcell, entered the employ of Bowie, Dash & Co. as a boy. From there he went to Williams, Russell & Co., then to the Union Coffee Co., and later to Hard & Rand. He is now head of the firm of Alex H. Purcell & Co. Robert C. Stewart first became known with Booth & Lindsley. He later went with Joseph A. Donahue & Sons, leaving there to establish the present firm of R.C. Stewart & Co. Another old-timer, Joseph D. Pixley, may be seen at his desk in Williams, Russell & Co.'s office every day, although Frank Williams, who began with Winthrop G. Ray & Co., and Frank C. Russell, both of Williams, Chapin & Russell and then of Williams, Russell & Co., have passed on. Fred P. Gordon, now head of Fred P. Gordon & Co., was formerly with Williams, Russell & Co. The Mitchell brothers, William L. and George, forming the firm of Mitchell Brothers, have been familiar Front Street figures for many years. A. Wakeman, the historian of the coffee trade, as he is often called, began with Ollendorf, Case & Gillespie. Later, he went with Thompson & Bowers, and then became a member of the firm Bays & Wakeman. He is now in business alone. For 38 years, Mr. Wakeman has been secretary of the Lower Wall Street's Business Men's Association. He is the author of History and Reminiscences of Lower Wall Street and Vicinity. H. Simmons of Simmons & Bain, later of Simmons & Newton, then of the Brazil Coffee Co., and finally of H. Simmons & Co., is at the time of writing one of the oldest coffee merchants on Front Street, having been in business in Baltimore and New York for more than 50 years. He has a desk in the office of his son, W. Lee Simmons, of W. Lee Simmons & Co. Bain is another well-known Front Street name. The firm of William Bain & Co. was established by William Bain Sr. in Baltimore. The business was moved to New York about 1885. The founder's three sons, William Jr., Daniel K., and L.P., entered the employ of the firm in Baltimore and moved with it to New York. Daniel K. Bain became associated with Henry Sheldon & Co., and later was a member of Simmons & Bain. He then returned to William Bain & Co. and was senior partner at the time of his death in 1915. William Bain Jr., for many years one of the governors and a past president and vice president of the New York Coffee Exchange, and his brother L.P. Bain, now conduct the business. John T. Foley, now of the Commercial Coffee Co., began with Kirkland Brothers. From there he went to Ezra Wheeler & Co., then to H. W. Banks & Co., Thompson, Shortridge & Co., and William Hosmer Bennett & Son. Joshua Walker formed a partnership with James Stewart as Stewart & Walker. Since the retirement of Mr. Stewart some years ago, Mr. Walker has been in business alone. Three other veterans of the trade are still in the harness. Louis Seligsburg, formerly of Wolf and Seligsburg, is now alone. Henry Schaefer has been at the head of S. Gruner & Co. since the death of Siegfried Gruner. Colonel William P. Room, who operated for some time as William P. Room & Co., is now head of the coffee department of Acker, Merrill & Condit Co. Gregory B. Liviorato, who founded the business of Liviorato Brothers at Port Said, with branches at Aden and Marseille, and later at Hodeidah and Harrah, entered the green coffee trade of New York in 1855, although his LF Mocha marks had been introduced here many years before. He remained here for 18 years, returned to his home in Cephalonia, Greece in 1904, and died there in 1905. His nephew, B. A. Liviorato, then assumed charge of the New York coffee business, which in 1913 became Liviorato Kidd & Co., with B. A. Liviorato and Frank Kidd. Benjamin Green Arnold, one-time Coffee King, first became well known as a member of Arnold, Sturgis & Co., afterward B. G. Arnold & Co. Mr. Arnold was one of the incorporators and the first president of the New York Coffee Exchange. Francis B. Arnold, with Arnold, Sturgis & Co., later of Arnold Mackey & Co., afterward Arnold Dorr & Co., was a son of Benjamin Green Arnold, and to him and to Major John R. McNulty belongs a great part of the credit for the organization of the New York Coffee Exchange. Major McNulty was with Minford Thompson & Co. and then formed the firm of J.R. McNulty & Co. Bowie Dash, a member of the famous Arnold Kimball Dash triumvirate, began with Scott and Miser, later Scott, Miser & Co., then Scott and Dash, afterward Scott, Dash & Co., and finally Bowie Dash & Co. Other well-known men with this last company were L. F. Mason, A. C. Foster, S. L. Swayze, L. J. Purdy, and John B. Overton. Then there were Rufus G. Story, Thomas Minford, Francis Skiddy, and George J. Nevers of Skiddy, Minford & Co. W. D. Thompson of Minford Thompson & Co., later L. W. Minford & Co., afterward Minford, Luder & Co. Thompson, Shortridge & Co., later Thompson Brothers, then Thompson and Davis. John Randall with L. W. Minford & Co., later with J. C. Runkle & Co. Eugene and James O'Sullivan of Eugene O'Sullivan & Co. The following names figured prominently in the trade's early history: Charles Maguire of James H. Taylor & Co. George F. Gilman, organizer of the Great American Tea Co. and of the Great Atlantic and Pacific Tea Co. H. W. Banks of Reeve, Case & Banks, afterwards of Stanton, Sheldon & Co., later Sheldon Banks & Co., and then of H. W. Banks & Co. Henry Sheldon of Stanton, Sheldon & Co., later Sheldon Banks & Co., and then Henry Sheldon & Co. William Macready with Small Brothers & Co., later with H. W. Banks & Co., and then with B. H. Howell Son & Co. C. R. Blakeman with Gross, March & Co., afterwards with William Scott's Sons & Co. William Scott of William Scott & Sons, later William Scott's Sons & Co., including George W. Vanderhoof, who later succeeded to the business under the name of George W. Vanderhoof & Co. Christopher and Leander S. Risley of C. Risley & Co., and Charles Nephew with C. Risley & Co., later with Edwin H. Peck & Co. Another group of old-timers includes William Newbold with Ezra Wheeler & Co., later alone, Augustus Ireland with Ezra Wheeler & Co., J. M. Edwards of Edwards & Maddox, later of J. M. Edwards & Co., Frank M. Anthony of J. M. Edwards & Co., H. Clay Maddox, one of the incorporators of the New York Coffee Exchange, of Edwards & Maddox, Baron Thompson of Thompson & Co., Gustav Amsink of G. Amsink & Co., James N. Jarvie with Small Brothers & Co., later of Arbuckle Brothers, John C. Lloyd of John C. Lloyd & Co., afterward with Arbuckle Brothers, John Small of Smalls & Bacon, later Small Brothers & Co., Williamson Bacon of Smalls & Bacon, afterward of Williamson Bacon & Co., C. K. Small of Mackey & Small, Anson Wales Hard and George Rand of Hard & Rand, Joseph Purcell, first of W. J. Porter & Co., and then of Hard & Rand, Henry F. McCreary with O'Shaughnessy & Sawley, later of Hard & Rand, William Sawley and John W. O'Shaughnessy of O'Shaughnessy & Sawley, Mr. O'Shaughnessy later forming John W. O'Shaughnessy & Co., and Mr. Sawley going to Hard & Rand. Mr. Sawley was one of the incorporators of the New York Coffee Exchange. Special mention should be made of Kirkland and von Sachs. A. Kirkland, one of the incorporators of the New York Coffee Exchange, with Small Brothers & Co., and then with W. J. Kirkland as Kirkland Brothers, and, upon the dissolution of that firm, with F. H. Leggett & Co. Thomas Rutter & Co. Teakle Wallace Lewis with Roland Humphrey & Co., later head of the coffee department of Carter Macy & Co., and still later head of T. W. Lewis & Co. Abraham Sanger of Sanger, Beers & Fisher, later Sanger & Wells. J. W. Wilson & Co. Dykes and Wilson. Peter, John, and Joseph J. O'Donoghue of John O'Donoghue's Sons. Joseph J. O'Donoghue and Sons. Otis W. Booth of Booth and Lindsley. A. G. Hildreth. James H. Kirby of B. G. Arnold & Co., later of Kirby, Halstead and Chapin, afterward Kirby and Halstead. Major Henry D. Tyler. Thomas H. Messenger & Co. Harvey H. Palmer of H. H. Palmer & Co. B. O. Bowers of Wilson & Bowers, later Thompson & Bowers. And August Hessler, first with C. Risley & Co., then with J. H. Laborie & Co., and finally with the green coffee department of George H. McFadden & Brother. John Hanley with Carey & Co., later of Hanry & Kinsella, St. Louis. Robert C. Hewitt, Jr., who wrote one of the early books on coffee, Coffee, Its History, Cultivation and Uses, 1872, of Hewitt and Fife, later James W. Fife & Co. James W. Fife of Hewitt and Fife, later James W. Fife & Co. Daniel A. Shaw of James W. Fife & Co. B. Leigh of James W. Fife & Co. and Winthrop G. Ray & Co. These names, too, will live long in green coffee history. Reed, Murdoch & Fisher, New York and Chicago. Charles A. and Watts Miller and David Palmer of D.J. Eli & Co., formerly D.J. and Z.S. Eli & Co., New York and Baltimore. Harry Miller with D.J. Eli & Co., later of Miller and Walbridge. Augustus Walbridge of Smith and Walbridge, afterward Augustus M. Walbridge, Inc. Clarence Smith of M.V.R. Smith's Sons, later of Smith and Walbridge. Stevens, Armstrong and Hartshorn, later Stevens and Armstrong, then Stevens Brothers & Co. And finally Reamer, Turner & Co., including Abraham Reamer Sr. and William F. Turner. Other familiar old-time names were George W. Pritchard of George W. Pritchard & Sons. Dayton & Co. Dimmond and Lally, later Dimmond and Gardes. Arthur W. Brown. Robert Russell of Russell & Co. J. F. Pupke and Thomas Reed of Pupke and Reed, later Eppens, Smith and Weeman. Afterward Eppens, Smith & Co., with William H. and Frederick P. Eppens. Joseph A. O'Brien with Pupke and Reed, and later in business for himself. R. P. McBride of the Union Pacific Tea Co. Ripley Ropes. Support Us Brothers. Mayer Brothers & Co. of Hamburg, with Moses G. Hanauer, manager, and D. K. Young and Herman Hanauer, salesman. H. M. Humphreys with J. W. Doane & Co., later with Arbuckle Brothers. Henry Nordlinger of Henry Nordlinger & Co. Charles Campbell of W. R. Grace & Co. D. A. DeLima of D. A. and J. DeLima, later D. A. DeLima & Co. Henry Cunard and George F. Kulk of Cunard & Co. Bolton, Bliss and Dallet, later Bliss, Dallet & Co., general managers of the Red D line of steamships. Prendergast Brothers. W. H. and George W. Crossman of W. H. Crossman & Brothers, later Crossman and Seelken with Herman Seelken, afterward Sorensen and Nielsen. F. Probst & Co. H. H. Swift & Co. J. L. Phipps & Co. James Bennett and Joseph Becker of Bennett & Becker. And Arnold Hines & Co., Diamond A. Mocha, later Arnold, Cheney & Company. Honorable mention should be accorded Samuel Wild, Old Dutch Mills. John Phoenix, with Husted, Ferguson and Titus, later of J. W. Phoenix & Co. H. K. Thurber of H. K. and F. B. Thurber & Co. Michael Barnacle, with Walter Storm, later Storm, Smith & Co., then Abbey, Freeman & Co., then with Husted, Wetmore and Titus, and finally alone. August Stump of August Stump & Co. J. K. and E. B. Place. Beards and Cummings, later Beards and Cottrell, then S. S. Beard & Co. Philip and Henry Data of Philip Data & Co. Hugh Edwards of Edwards and Raworth. William Bennett of William Hosmer Bennett & Son. Kalman Haas of Haas Brothers. J.C. Runkle & Co. Thomas T. Barr and Fred T. Sherman of Barr, Lally & Co., later T. Barr & Co. Henry Hentz & Co. Elmenhorst & Co. A. S. Lassell & Co. D. Henderson, Harry, and John Wells of Wells Brothers. G. Weil & Co., later Norton, Weil & Bevan, and then Weil & Norton. Warren & Co. J. H. Laborie & Co. Schultz and Ruckgaber. Henry Eyre. Rowland, Terry & Humphreys, later Rowland & Humphreys. Bentley, Benton & Co. Winter and Smiley. Weston and Gray. John S. Wright, one of the incorporators of the New York Coffee Exchange, of Wright, Hard & Co. Watjen, Tall & Co. A. Behrens & Co. Steve Matheson of S. Matheson Jr. & Co. C. Wessels & Brothers, later Wessels Kuhlenkampf & Co., and finally Fromm & Co. Julius Steinwender of Steinwender, Stoffregen & Co. Leon Israel of Leon Israel & Brothers. Herklotz, Korn & Co. Ponfold, Schuyler & Co. Maitland, Phelps & Co., later Maitland, Koppel & Co. F. H. Leggett of F. H. Leggett & Co. Carhart & Brother. George W. Flanders of George W. Flanders & Co. Jonas P. O'Brien. George S. Wallen of George S. Wallen & Co. Charles F. Blake of Blake & Bullard. And Martin J. Glynn of MacDonald & Glynn, later Martin J. Glynn & Co., who had their office at Front Street and Old Slip for 25 years. Three other names closely associated with the early days of the New York green coffee trade were Glover, Force & Co., later Waterbury & Force, then W. H. Force & Co., and finally W. S. Force & Co., weighers and forwarders. Daniel Reeve of Reeve & Van Riper, mixers and hullers, and John H. Draper & Co., auctioneers. Growth of the leading coffee ports. 22 years ago, when the century opened, New York passed over her docks a total of 676 million pounds of coffee, which represented 86% of the total for the country. In 1920, juggling the figures a little, she imported 767 million pounds, which was 59% of the total. While she was thus practically marking time, she watched New Orleans run wild with an increase from 44 million pounds to 380 million pounds, or 763% gain. This meaning also the supplying of 29% of the country's demand instead of 5%, while San Francisco in the same time jumped from 24 million pounds to 137 million pounds, or 470% gain, her share of the total trade now being 10% instead of 3% in 1900. These gains, however, have not all been made at the expense of the city on the Hudson. In 1900, Baltimore was a close rival of New Orleans and was far ahead of all other ports except New York. But a decline in her imports began about 1903 and was so swift that 5 years later her imports were almost negligible. New Orleans began her advance at about the same time that Baltimore began to fall off, so that her rise to a place of importance as a coffee port has been practically coincident with the 20th century. Her first big step upward was in 1901, from 44 million to 72 million pounds, and was followed by another the next year to 115 million. Thereafter was a steady gain to 213 million pounds in 1906, and to 301 million pounds in 1910, and after that wide fluctuations, especially during the war. In 1918, doubtless because of the draining of shipping to the North Atlantic service, there was a heavy slump, but immediately after the war, in the calendar year of 1919, there was a big jump to a record mark, up to that time, of 356 million pounds. This was followed by the record of 380 million pounds in the calendar year 1920, although the 1921 figure of 331,036,770 shows a falling off of nearly £50 million. San Francisco's growth, on the other hand, is of recent occurrence. The story is told farther along in this chapter how the city was definitely placed on the coffee map by the provision of adequate shipping facilities to Central America. The outbreak of the war in Europe, however, which loosened the grip of European nations on the coffee crops of Central America, was the prime cause of San Francisco's rise in the coffee world, affording her an opportunity of which she had the enterprise to take full advantage. In 1913, her imports were only about £36 million, at which mark they had stood for many years. There was only a slight gain until 1916, when £71 million were recorded, but this increased to £97 million in 1917, to £134 million in 1918 fiscal year, and to £160 million in the calendar year 1919. In 1920, there was a falling off to £137 million, and it may be that the high figure reached the year before represents about the maximum that her natural market, the Pacific Coast region, can well absorb. Early days of green coffee in New Orleans. The history of New Orleans as a coffee port may be considered as beginning with the transfer of Louisiana by Napoleon Bonaparte to the United States in 1803. In this year, according to Martin's History of Louisiana, New Orleans imported 1,438 bags of coffee of £132 each. In the latter part of the 18th century, settlers in large numbers had crossed the Allegheny Mountains from the Atlantic states into the valley of the Ohio River, and their crops of grain and provisions were exported by means of cheaply constructed rafts and boats, which were floated down the river to New Orleans, where they were generally broken up and sold for use as lumber and firewood, there being, at that time, no power available for propelling them back against the current of the river. From 1803 until 1820, on account of the difficulty of navigating upstream, New Orleans imports did not increase as rapidly as exports. In 1814, however, the first crude steamboat had begun to carry freight on the river, and by 1820, the supremacy of the New Orleans as the gateway of the Mississippi Valley had been, for the time, established by this new means of transportation. The coffee importing business flourished, and, from its modest beginning in 1803, grew to 531,236 bags in 1857. By this time, however, New Orleans had begun to feel the competition of the Erie Canal and of the systems of east and west railroad lines which had been in the course of active construction during the preceding 15 years. The railroad systems, which had as their ports Boston, New York, Philadelphia, and Baltimore, entered upon a desperate war of freight rates, each in the endeavor to establish the supremacy of its own port. As the building of railroads had been entirely east and west, and no large amount of capital had been invested in north and south lines, much of the business of the valley was diverted to the Atlantic ports, apparently never to return to New Orleans. In 1862, on account of the blockade of the port, not a bag of coffee was imported through New Orleans, and practically none came in until the year 1866, when the small amount of 55,000 bags was the total for the year. At about this time, Boston and Philadelphia became negligible importing quantities. The business of Baltimore continued to be quite prosperous, and New York rapidly increased her imports and took the commanding position. New Orleans had increased her coffee imports to 250,000 bags in 1871, and the yearly imports continued at about this figure until the last decade of the century, when the business began to expand. The imports had reached a total of 337,000 bags in 1893 to 1894, and of 373,000 bags in 1896 to 97. This was the beginning of a new era, and the coffee business of New Orleans entered upon the period of its greatest growth. Imports were 514,000 bags in 1900 to 01, and were slightly more than twice that by 1903 to 04. In 1909 to 10, the import had again doubled, and had reached a total for the 12 months ending July 1, 1909, of slightly more than 2 million bags, while the figures for the calendar year 1909 totaled 2.5 million bags. Burino and Brother, 77 Gravier Street, were the largest importers of coffee in New Orleans in 1869. The principal importers in 1880 were P. Porcine & Co., Westfeldt Brothers, Dimond & Gardez, Schmidt & Ziegler, J. L. Phillips & Co., George O. Gordon & Co., and Smith Brothers. Shipments were by sailing vessels, a full cargo being about 5,000 bags. Fancy grades like Golden Rios, Washed, and Peaberries were shipped in double bags. Musty coffees were common, and every bag in a cargo was sampled for must. S. Jackson was first to issue regular manifests. With the entry of steamers into the coffee transport business, New Orleans was placed at a disadvantage as steamer rates were about 20 cents a bag higher to New Orleans than to New York, and imports were limited. The subsequent revival of the business was due largely to Hard and Rand. Being unable to obtain steamer rates equal to those quoted in New York, Hard and Rand chartered steamers for New Orleans, and soon the trade began to offer cost and freight to New Orleans, and the business grew from about 350,000 bags of green coffee per annum to 2.5 million bags. One of the best remembered names in the green coffee trade of New Orleans is that of Charles Dittman, 1848 to 1920, who, for nearly 50 years, was one of the leading coffee commission merchants of the country. Mr. Dittman entered the coffee business with Napier & Co., representing E. Johnston & Co. of Rio de Janeiro. In 1875, upon the death of Mr. Napier, the firm changed to Johnston, Gordon & Co., later to G. O. Gordon, and in 1886 to the Charles Dittman Co. Since his death in 1920, the business has been continued by F. V. Allain and Charles Dittman, Jr. Green coffee in San Francisco. In the early days of the green coffee business in San Francisco, these names stood out as most important among the coffee importers: Hellman Brothers & Co., Montalegre & Co., ELGS Steel & Co., and Uruguaya and Uriost. From their many friends in Central America, they, and others in their line, obtained small consignments that were bought by the roasters according to their immediate needs. Often as many as 5 or 6 buyers would share in a parcel of 50 bags, as they were not in the custom of filling up the larder for days of want. There always seemed to be sufficient for everyone, and bull movement and corners had not then become the vogue. Just as today, the mainstays of the early San Francisco trade were coffees produced in Costa Rica, Salvador, and Guatemala, although some were brought from the Colima district of Mexico. The broker had a comparatively easy job in selling his wares. Samples of the lots would be given to him in carefully sealed glass bottles, and usually the buyer would trust his discerning eye to judge correctly the quality of the goods, not even taking the trouble to uncork the bottle. Size, color, and imperfections would be his criterion. The leading coffee importers at San Francisco in 1875 were B. E. Auger & Co., 409 Battery, S. A. Carrot & Co., 405 Front Street, Hellman Brothers & Co., 525 Front Street, Adolph Lowe & Co., 208 California Street, S. C. Merrill & Co., 204 California Street, Parrott & Co., 306 California Street, and Uruguaya and Uriost, 405 Front Street. The annual consumption of green coffee in San Francisco in the early 80s was estimated at 100,000 bags. A marked change in the coffee business of San Francisco was brought about by the discovery that the differences in the taste of coffees could not be accurately detected from their color or from the size of bean. To Clarence E. Bickford belongs the credit of having discovered the cup qualities of high-grown Central American coffees. He was employed at the time by a broker named Hochhofler, and probably did not realize what far-reaching effect his discovery would have on the future of San Francisco's coffee trade. But no other factor has contributed so much to its growth. When the roasters began to examine coffees for their taste, values were, of course, revolutionized. Antiguas and other high-grown coffees that had theretofore been penalized for the small size of bean soon brought a premium and have ever since been in great demand. It goes without saying that the new classification was of material assistance to the roasters in bettering their output, as blending was then put on a scientific basis. About the middle of the 90s, San Francisco began to function as a distributing center, and shipments were made from there to St. Louis and Cincinnati. The selection of coffees on their cup merit was undoubtedly a factor of considerable importance in creating new outlets, although it is generally conceded that the winning personality of C.E. Bickford helped considerably. Mr. Bickford, by this time, had succeeded his former employer. He served the trade by living up to the best standards of business practice until his death in 1908, when the institution he founded was continued by E. H. O'Brien under the name of C. E. Bickford & Co. San Francisco imported 175,293 bags of coffee in 1900. Imports had grown to 256,183 bags by 1906. The imports of green coffee at San Francisco in 1914-15 amounted to about 400,000 bags. The beginning of the World War was almost coincidental with an energetic campaign waged by San Francisco coffee interests to popularize Central American coffees, and particularly Guatemala's, in this country. The time was well chosen, as the World's Exposition at San Francisco offered a good opportunity to acquaint the public with the fine qualities of Guatemala growths. Furthermore, it was necessary to create new markets for these coffees, which in former years had been very extensively used in Europe. Figures show that San Francisco's efforts were crowned with success. In 1916, the importation increased by 50%, and in 1917, importations were double those of 1915. In 1918, a total of nearly 1 million bags was reached, and this mark was passed by almost 200,000 in 1919. In 1920, 971,567 bags were imported. The origin of San Francisco's fight for control of Central American coffee dates back to the years 1908 to 1910, when the German Cosmos Line was fighting the Pacific Mail for the Central and South American shipping business. W.R. Grace & Co. at that time were already the heaviest shippers of American merchandise to the Latin American countries, and while their own steamers were not touching at Central American ports, they were handling merchandise from the United States and nitrates from the South American countries in their own bottoms, and were also engaged as general carriers for that trade. The fight directed by the Cosmos Line against the Pacific Mail, which at that time was under the control of the Southern Pacific Company, was accordingly directed against the Grace interest also, so far as South American countries were concerned. The fight was long and bitter and costly to both sides. At times, the contenders offered to take freight not only without charge, but to pay the shipper a premium for the privilege of carrying his freight. Differences were finally settled in conference, but the experience taught the American interests that they could survive in any territory only if at all times they were able to provide their own cargoes for their own boats, as had been accomplished with nitrate in South America. J. H. Rossiter, the Grace manager, who later became well known as Director of Operations of the United States Shipping Board during the war, undertook an extended trip to Central America in 1912 to study the situation at close range. There was only one product of Central America that was available in cargo quantities, namely coffee, and naturally his attention was drawn to the possibility of carrying coffee to San Francisco to provide return cargoes for ships of the Pacific Mail, or associated lines, carrying merchandise for the Central American countries. While in Guatemala, Mr. Rossiter outlined a future policy in regard to Central American coffees, the basis being his firm determination that coffees grown in Central America, and logically and geographically tributary to San Francisco distribution, should come to San Francisco in largely increasing quantities. Up to that time, San Francisco had received, on an average, only 200,000 bags of Central American coffee annually for the 10 preceding years, while Europe had received about 1.5 million bags a year. The quantity necessary to make San Francisco a factor would call for an importation, on an average, of 750,000 bags, a quantity almost 4 times as large as then established. This was an extremely ambitious undertaking, considering the conditions then prevailing in Central America. European countries were firmly entrenched in the coffee business in Central America, with Germany leading in Guatemala, France in Salvador and Nicaragua, England and France contending for superiority in Costa Rica, and the United States getting only the leavings. The European countries held their position in the Central American coffee trade by liberal financing and a thorough knowledge of the varying qualities of coffee produced on the different plantations. San Francisco, the only important port in the United States dealing in Central American coffees, had neither strong financial entrenchment in Central America nor expert knowledge of coffee quality. Year after year, San Francisco merchants had depended on consignments chosen by the consignors. This rendered quality selection of coffees by the importers impossible. Rossiter, being primarily a steamship man, tackled the proposition from the standpoint of transportation, figuring that if he could establish and maintain a preferential steamer service to San Francisco and steady freight rates, a great step would be accomplished toward the desired end. This led to his interest in the Pacific Mail Company, of which the final outcome was his present position as vice president of the reorganized Pacific Mail Company. In that capacity, he maintained, practically throughout the entire period of the World War, freight rates on coffee from Central America to San Francisco that gave that Pacific port an immediate and definite advantage. This gave merchants in San Francisco the chance to build up a steady trade, and prevented other ports in the United States from entering into serious competition with San Francisco as a distributing point for Central American coffees. The view taken by Rossiter was as far-sighted as it was broad. He argued that with the end of the war, there would be no strength in a scattering distribution of Central American coffees by New York, New Orleans, and San Francisco, and the only promise of maintenance of the business for the United States would be in maintaining unity of distribution in one port of the United States, namely San Francisco. The first year open to European competition after the war showed that San Francisco was well able to maintain its lead in Central American coffees. Today, the mortgages formerly held by European merchants on the native coffee plantations, and the control thereby of the produce of these plantations, are in the hands of American merchants. And what is more, out of general merchandising and importing by merchants of San Francisco, there have developed expert coffee departments in all of the larger houses. The years of the war brought the product of virtually all plantations in Central America to the intimate knowledge of these expert coffee departments, and today the advantage that Europe formerly had, of knowing exactly what a specific plantation produced, is possessed by San Francisco merchants. This is no small advantage when we consider that in Guatemala and Costa Rica, qualities vary from plantation to plantation, and that often on adjoining plantation there is from 3 to 5 cents a pound difference in quality from the standpoint of cup merit. One cannot buy coffee in Central America as in Brazil, as these countries are not highly organized commercially, and the importers here are forced to assume the role of the Brazilian commissario and banker. The crop has to be financed from 6 to 9 months before it is brought to the port, and the securities covering such advances are at best of questionable value, on account of political insecurity and the ever-threatening earthquakes and the uncertainty of the elements. Distribution of the coffee after it has been brought to San Francisco also involves many difficulties, notwithstanding that the demand is good. This will be better realized when we consider that the Pacific coast from Alaska to Mexico and eastward as far as the Rocky Mountains embraces a population of about 8 million, whose annual consumption is estimated at 400,000 bags, and that, as already stated, treble that quantity was imported to San Francisco in 1919. In 1900, 99 firms were engaged in the green coffee importing business, some were roasters also, in New York, 6 in Philadelphia, 28 in San Francisco, 12 in New Orleans. In 1920, there were 216 in New York, 31 in San Francisco, and 15 in New Orleans. End of Section 46, Part 1.